You can't be serious. He's in first class? Veronica Halstead's voice sliced through the cabin. Look at him. And the kid, this isn't a daycare. Heads turned. Curiosity did the rest. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The flight attendant paused mid-step, smile pinned in place. The single dad didn't argue. He lifted his daughter into the window seat, tucked a thin blanket around her shoulders, and checked the small inhaler case clipped to his bag as if the insult were weather. Veronica leaned closer, perfume and certainty. People pay for this cabin for a reason. If you can't afford it, just say that. He didn't snap back. He didn't plead. He watched his daughter's face, counted her breaths, and nodded once, calm, contained, like a man saving his voice for something that mattered. His stillness didn't match his worn jacket. While other passengers sank into leather, he checked the seatbelt latch twice and read the safety card without embarrassment. Lila's fingers were cold on the armrest, her eyes too wide for a child who was supposed to be excited. "It's okay," he murmured, voice low. "Breathe with me." He wasn't trying to win a room. He was trying to keep a small chest steady. Veronica mistook restraint for weakness. She turned to the attendant, power in every syllable. "Move him, or I'll make calls before we push back." "Ma'am," the attendant said carefully, "his boarding pass is valid." "Then your system is broken," Veronica replied, loud enough to recruit witnesses. The father's jaw tightened once, then released. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, and toward the forward curtain and the cockpit door beyond it. Not with fear, with awareness. The click of a galley latch made him inhale slowly, controlled. He wasn't cataloging luxury. He was cataloging exits, routines, the way the aircraft sounded when everything was normal. Veronica filled the silence anyway. She talked about standards and people who game the system. Each sentence painted him as a mistake that needed correcting. A man in a blazer stared at his tray table. A woman across the aisle glanced at Lila and softened, then looked away as if kindness might get her involved. The father finally raised his eyes not to fight, but to set a boundary, tired, clear. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "my daughter's not feeling well. If you need something, ask the crew, please." Veronica let out a short laugh. "Politeness doesn't buy you a seat." The attendant tried to redirect. "We're preparing for departure. Everyone needs to be seated." Veronica sat, but her words kept reaching, small hooks thrown across the aisle. He didn't respond. He adjusted the air vent above Lila and offered her water. His thumb brushed the inhaler case again, a habit shaped by too many nights of listening for wheeze in the dark. Outside the window, ramp lights blurred as the aircraft began to roll. The engines rose in pitch, a steady whine that vibrated through the frame and into bone. Lila's breathing hitched. He felt it before she said it. He always did. "Daddy, it's tight," she whispered. His expression barely shifted, but something behind his eyes locked into focus. "Okay," he said, like they were practicing steps. "We do the plan." He guided her hands, slowed her inhale, counted rhythm with the light pressure of his palm against his back. It was quiet work, intimate and urgent, love doing its job. Veronica glanced over, irritated by the softness. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Now he's making a scene." The father didn't glare at her. He didn't even look. His patience thinned, not because of her, but because the air felt drier, the cabin tighter, and his child was struggling while strangers measured their worth in fabric and fare class. The announcement crackled overhead, bright and automatic, as the plane lined up. Cabin lights dimmed a fraction. The cockpit door stayed closed, but sound traveled. A muted beep, a clipped exchange, the cadence of professionals making checklists real. He recognized that cadence the way a body recognizes an old scar. He stared at the seam of the cockpit door half a second too long, then pulled himself back to Lila. His life wasn't cockpits anymore. It was this small hand squeezing his finger. Veronica leaned toward the aisle, scanning forward as if someone important would appear on cue. "I fly weekly," she said, pitching her voice for an audience. "I know the captain. If this becomes a problem, he'll handle it." The father tightened Lila's blanket and whispered, "You're safe. I've got you." Then the engine surged. Every body pressed into their seats. The rich woman finally stopped talking, because the aircraft, indifferent to status, demanded everyone's silence at once, without asking anyone's permission. The aircraft leveled briefly before climbing, engines roaring with a force that swallowed conversation. Lila's fingers dug into her father's sleeve as the nose lifted, and he leaned close, voice steady against the vibration. "In through your nose, slow, hold it. That's it." Her breathing followed his rhythm, uneven at first, then gradually smoothing beneath the mechanical hum. Across the aisle, Veronica adjusted her silk scarf as though turbulence were a personal inconvenience. She glanced at them again, irritation sharpening her features. "If she's sick," she said, not bothering to lower her voice, "maybe economy would have been more appropriate. This cabin isn't equipped for episodes." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The woman by the window, 2 rows up, frowned. The man in the blazer pretended to read his email, though his screen remained frozen. The accusation hung in the recycled air, thick and sour. He exhaled slowly. Arguing would only feed her. "She has asthma," he said evenly. "We're managing it." Veronica let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Managing? By disrupting everyone else's flight?" The seatbelt sign chimed off with a soft ding, and the cabin relaxed by degrees. A flight attendant approached cautiously. "Is everything all right here?" Before he could answer, Veronica leaned into the aisle. "No, it isn't. I paid for peace and quiet. Instead, I'm sitting next to a man who clearly doesn't understand the standards of this section." The attendant's eyes flicked to the boarding manifest on her tablet. "Ma'am, his ticket is confirmed." "That doesn't mean it's appropriate," Veronica snapped. "There are expectations." The father met the attendant's gaze. There was apology in his eyes, but not shame. "We're fine," he said softly. "Thank you." The attendant hesitated, then nodded and stepped away, tension trailing her like static. Lila shifted closer, resting her head against his arm. "Did I do something wrong?" she whispered. He swallowed hard. "No, sweetheart. Some people just forget how to be kind." Veronica heard that. Color rose in her cheeks. "Kindness has nothing to do with it. It's about standards. This is first class." He finally looked at her fully, calm, measured. "And we're seated." The simplicity of it unsettled her more than anger would have. She straightened in her seat, pulling out her phone as though summoning reinforcement. "I know the airline's bored," she muttered. "This won't go unnoticed." The aircraft gave a subtle shudder, barely perceptible, but his body registered it instantly. A change in engine tone followed, faint yet distinct. His eyes lifted toward the ceiling panels, listening. Not fear, assessment. Veronica caught the movement. "What now?" she demanded. "Are you nervous?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached up and adjusted the air vent again, checking the airflow pattern with practiced fingers. Lila's breathing remained steady. That mattered more than anything else. A chime sounded from the forward galley. Two crew members exchanged quick looks before disappearing behind the curtain toward the cockpit. Passengers noticed. Murmurs rippled. Veronica scoffed. See? This is what happens when distractions are allowed. The absurdity almost drew a smile from him. He leaned toward Lila. You're doing great, he murmured, just like we practiced. The woman across the aisle finally spoke up, tentative but firm. Maybe we should all just let them be. Veronica turned, offended. Excuse me? Before the exchange could escalate further, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice emerged, measured, controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a minor systems notification. Nothing to be alarmed about. We're assessing it now. Minor. The word echoed differently in his mind. He knew the cadence of reassurance when something wasn't quite routine. Lila felt the shift in his posture. Daddy? It's okay, he said again, always okay, even when he was calculating possibilities. The plane trembled lightly, then steadied. Conversation resumed in cautious fragments. Veronica lowered her phone, unsettled despite herself. Systems notification, she muttered. That doesn't sound minor. He glanced once more toward the cockpit door, own eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. He recognized the subtle drop in ambient vibration, the slight change in pitch beneath the engines. Something had been adjusted, something not standard. Veronica noticed his focus and bristled. What exactly are you staring at? Listening, he corrected quietly. To what? He hesitated, then shook his head. Probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The forward curtain shifted again. The same flight attendant stepped out, expression composed yet tighter than before. She scanned the cabin briefly, gaze lingering on him for half a heartbeat longer than necessary. Veronica followed that glance and stiffened. Why are they looking at you? He didn't respond. Because beneath the surface, under the silk scarves and status and polished shoes, the flight had shifted into something else, and the man she'd tried to dismiss wasn't out of place at all. If you're feeling the tension building, subscribe now, because what's coming next changes everything. The aircraft shuddered again, not violently, just enough to make every conversation die mid-sentence. And this time, even Veronica stopped talking. The shudder didn't fade this time. It lingered, subtle but wrong. A tremor that traveled through the floor and into bone, as if the aircraft were reconsidering its balance mid-air. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied. No one spoke at first. Silence rolled through the cabin like a wave. Even Veronica seemed unsure whether to resume her campaign. Lila looked up at her father. Was that supposed to happen? He didn't answer immediately. He was listening again, counting seconds between engine pitch shifts, tracking the faint vibration under his shoes. Something had changed in the rhythm of flight. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't routine. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain began, voice controlled but tighter now. We're working through a systems indication in the cockpit. We'll keep you informed. Indication. His jaw tightened. Veronica crossed her arms. You see, this is exactly what I was talking about. Chaos. That's not how systems work, he said quietly, almost to himself. She leaned forward. Oh? And you're an expert now? He exhaled slowly. No, just observant. The forward galley door opened abruptly. A crew member stepped out, speaking in hushed urgency to the lead attendant. Their posture gave it away, shoulders slightly forward, movements efficient, no wasted gestures. Not panic, but pressure. The passengers began whispering. The man in the blazer set his phone down. The woman, 2 rows up, reached for her husband's hand. Lila's breathing quickened again. He shifted closer, lowering his voice. "Focus on me, same as before." Another vibration rippled through the cabin, stronger this time. A faint mechanical whine followed, high-pitched and persistent. Veronica's confidence began to fracture around the edges. "What is that sound?" No one answered her, because now everyone could hear it. The aircraft banked slightly left, not sharply, just enough to feel deliberate. His eyes moved instinctively toward the wing outside the window. He studied the angle, the flap positioning, the steadiness of the horizon. Calculations ran behind his calm expression, quiet and precise. The curtain at the front swayed as someone inside moved quickly. A muffled exchange slipped through, clipped voices layered with static. Veronica stood halfway from her seat. "I want to speak to the captain." The flight attendant stepped forward immediately. "Ma'am, please remain seated." "I have a right to know what's happening. We're addressing it." Her voice rose. "Addressing what? A failure?" The word landed heavy. Heads turned toward the cockpit door again, and then it happened. A sharper jolt, not violent, but undeniable. Gasps filled the cabin. Lila grabbed her father's arm. "Daddy, I've got you." His tone didn't change, not even a fraction, but his posture did. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he listened to the engine response after the jolt. A delay, a correction attempt, a secondary adjustment. That wasn't standard. Veronica noticed his focus again, and fear twisted into something defensive. "Why do you look like you know something?" He didn't respond. The intercom clicked again, but this time it wasn't the captain. It was the first officer, and his voice lacked the earlier polish. "We're working through an instrument discrepancy. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Instrument discrepancy. That wasn't minor. A crew member hurried from the cockpit, nearly colliding with the galley counter. She steadied herself, breath shallow but controlled. And that's when Veronica made her mistake. She stepped into the aisle and pointed directly at him. "This man has been acting strange since we took off. He keeps staring at the cockpit like he's analyzing something. If there's a problem, maybe you should question him." The accusation cut through the air sharper than the turbulence. Every eye shifted toward him. The crew member paused. He looked up slowly, not angry, just tired of the noise. "My daughter's breathing was unstable," he said calmly. "I was monitoring airflow and pressure changes, that's all." Veronica scoffed. "Airflow? Pressure? You're not in charge here." The crew member studied him more closely now, not suspicion, curiosity. "What do you do, sir?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. He hadn't said the words in years. "I used to fly," he answered simply. The cabin stilled. Veronica blinked. "Fly what? A hobby plane?" He didn't rise to it. "Air Force," he said. The crew member's posture shifted instantly. "What was your role?" "Test pilot, aeronautical engineering background." The high-pitched whine in the cabin intensified. The crew member glanced toward the cockpit door. "Stay here," she said, already turning. Veronica's expression drained of color. "You're lying," she whispered. He met her eyes evenly. "I don't lie about things that matter." The cockpit door opened a fraction. A hand signaled urgently. The crew member leaned inside. A rapid exchange followed, low, urgent, technical. Then she stepped back out and looked directly at him. "Sir," she said, voice steady but unmistakably serious, "the captain would like to speak with you." The cabin collectively inhaled. Veronica sat down slowly, and for the first time since boarding she had nothing to say. For a moment no one moved. The request hung in the air like suspended breath. Lila's fingers tightened around his sleeve. "Daddy." He crouched slightly so their eyes were level. The hum of the aircraft felt louder now. The high-pitched whine, threading beneath it like tension, pulled too tight. "I'm going to talk to the captain," he said softly. "Just talk. You stay right here. Keep breathing the way we practiced." Her eyes searched his face for any sign of fear. She didn't find it. That steadiness, the one he wore like armor, settled her more than any reassurance could. "Okay," she whispered. He brushed her hair back from her forehead, then stood. The forward galley suddenly felt narrower than before. The air carried a faint metallic tang, recycled and dry. As he stepped into the aisle, every gaze tracked him, curious, anxious, recalibrating. Veronica's expression flickered between disbelief and something darker. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "Now they can't just let a passenger into the cockpit." He paused briefly beside her row, not looking down at her, not rising above. Just level. "They can," he said evenly, "when the alternative is worse." The words weren't dramatic, they were factual. The crew member gestured him forward, urgency contained but unmistakable. As he reached the cockpit door, another tremor rippled through the aircraft, slightly stronger than before. Not violent, but wrong. The cockpit interior glowed with instrument light. The captain turned halfway in his seat, headset still on, eyes assessing the man stepping inside. "You said you flew Air Force?" Captain Raymond Ivers asked without preamble. "Yes." "Aircraft?" "Primarily modified transport platforms. Systems testing. Failure simulations." The first officer glanced over, sweat beating faintly at his temple. "We've got inconsistent data on one of the stabilization systems. Autopilot disengaged twice. Manual correction isn't holding the way it should." The captain didn't have time for pride. "We're not asking you to fly, just tell me if this behavior matches a known cascade." He stepped closer, scanning the instrument panel instinctively, not touching anything. His eyes moved quickly, absorbing data. The faint oscillation in pitch beneath the aircraft matched what he was seeing. "When did it start?" he asked. 10 minutes after climb." He nodded once. Outside the cockpit, the cabin remained suspended in uneasy quiet. Lila stared at the closed door. Veronica tried to look composed, but her hands gripped the armrest too tightly. The woman across the aisle whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Inside, he exhaled slowly. "If it's the sensor feedback loop I'm thinking of," he said, voice steady, "manual input will feel like it's working, until the correction overshoots." The first officer's jaw tightened. "That's exactly what it's doing." The captain's eyes sharpened. "And the workaround?" He hesitated. Not because he didn't know, but because speaking the next words would shift the atmosphere from uncertain to serious. "You isolate the feedback source," he said quietly. "Or you fly against it with controlled dampening. But if the sensor's misreading altitude or pitch—" Another subtle dip in the aircraft interrupted him. "You'll fight yourself the whole way down." Silence filled the cockpit for half a second. The captain's fingers hovered over a switch panel. "We've already isolated one channel." "Then don't isolate another blindly," he replied. "You need confirmation before pulling redundancy." The first officer exchanged a quick look with the captain. They were professionals, but they were operating in narrowing margins now. In the cabin, whispers grew louder. Someone had begun recording on their phone. Veronica stared fixedly at the cockpit door, as if willing it to open and restore her sense of control. Another chime sounded overhead, short, sharp. Inside, the captain made a decision. "Stay," he told him. Not as a passenger, as an asset. He nodded once. He wasn't here to prove anything. Not to Veronica, not to the cabin, just to keep the aircraft stable and to get back to his daughter. Outside, Lila watched the cockpit door with quiet faith. She didn't understand the instruments or the tension woven into the engine's pitch. But she understood her father, and she trusted him more than anyone in that cabin. The plane shuddered again. This time, everyone felt it. The shudder rolled through the aircraft harder than before, rattling over head bins and pulling a few startled cries from the cabin. Glassware clinked sharply in the galley. The high-pitched whine deepened into something uneven, like a machine straining against its own rhythm. Inside the cockpit, warning lights pulsed amber against dim instrument panels. The captain's jaw flexed. "There, you feel that?" "Yes," he answered quietly. "It's compensating too aggressively." The first officer adjusted manual input again. The yoke resisted slightly, then overcorrected. The aircraft tilted, subtle but undeniable. Outside, Veronica grabbed the armrest. Her composure cracked visibly now. "This is unacceptable," she whispered. But it wasn't an outrage anymore. It was fear. Lila pressed both hands over her ears as the engine tone shifted again. Back in the cockpit, he leaned forward, not touching controls, just watching data cascade across screens. "You're fighting a false signal," he said. "If the stabilization system thinks you're pitching higher than you are, it'll keep trimming against you." The captain nodded once. "We isolated primary feedback. The secondary is still reading clean." "Clean doesn't mean correct," he replied. "If the redundancy's mirroring bad data..." Another tremor cut him off. Stronger. The altitude indicator flickered momentarily before stabilizing again. "That's not just turbulence," the first officer muttered. He inhaled slowly. The sound under the engines had changed again, a faint vibration layering beneath thrust. "You need to dampen manually, smaller inputs. Don't chase it." The captain followed the guidance, easing control pressure. The aircraft responded, still unstable, but less reactive. In the cabin, murmurs rose into scattered panic. Someone asked for a drink. Someone else demanded answers. A child further back began crying. Veronica stood halfway up again before the seatbelt sign snapped back on with a sharp ding. "Ma'am, sit down," a flight attendant ordered firmly. She dropped into her seat, shaken now. The authority she'd leaned on earlier meant nothing against physics. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice emerged, steadier than the situation warranted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're managing a technical issue. Please remain seated." Managing. He knew what that tone cost. Inside the cockpit, another alert chimed. Longer this time. The first officer swallowed. "We're getting conflicting altitude data." There it was. "Cross-check against raw pressure readings," he said immediately. "Ignore computed feed for a second." The captain did. His eyes moved quickly across backup instrumentation. The numbers didn't align. He felt the weight of it settle. "This isn't catastrophic," he said carefully. "But if you let the system keep correcting itself, you'll burn fuel fighting nothing." The captain glanced at him. "You've seen this before." "In simulations." The word hung between them. Simulations meant controlled environments. This wasn't one. Outside, Lila stared at the cockpit door, breathing slower now but eyes wide. The woman across the aisle squeezed her hand gently. Veronica's lips trembled. She didn't look toward the father's seat anymore. She looked forward. Waiting. Another jolt, sharp enough to make several passengers gasp. A bag fell from an overhead bin in the row behind first class. Inside the cockpit, tension spiked. "We're not getting stable feedback," the first officer said, voice tight. He closed his eyes for half a second, not in panic but in calculation. He replayed the sensation of the earlier oscillation, matching it against instrument readings. It's lag, he said suddenly. There's latency in the sensor. It's correcting based on outdated input. The captain's gaze snapped to him. That would explain the overshoot. Yes, if you slow everything down, fly as if the data's half a second old, you can neutralize the oscillation. The first officer adjusted his control timing accordingly. The aircraft steadied. Not perfectly, but noticeably. In the cabin, the difference was subtle, but real. The tremors softened. The whine evened out slightly. Passengers exchanged hopeful looks. Veronica exhaled shakily, unaware she'd been holding her breath. The captain glanced sideways. "Stay with us." He nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Because now, it wasn't about humiliation or vindication. It was about controlled descent through unstable information, and the next few minutes would determine whether this remained a manageable anomaly or escalated into something far worse. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. Because what happens next changes every assumption in this cabin. Another alert chimed, this one louder, and every professional instinct inside him sharpened at once. The louder alert didn't stop. It pulsed. Steady, insistent, impossible to ignore. Inside the cockpit, amber turned briefly red before settling back again. The first officer's hand hovered, then withdrew from a switch he almost engaged. "Don't," he said calmly. Both pilots looked at him. "That's the automatic trim override. If the data's lagging, forcing it could amplify the oscillation." The captain's eyes narrowed. Not in doubt, but in calculation. "Then what?" "Let the system think you're cooperating," he replied quietly. "Reduce manual input even more. Fly smoother than you think you need to." The aircraft dipped slightly, then corrected, more gently this time. In the cabin, the movement felt different. Less violent. Still wrong, but controlled. Lila's breathing stayed steady now, her earlier panic replaced by focused trust. She kept her eyes on the cockpit door. Veronica, meanwhile, had gone pale. The woman who'd once filled the aisle with authority now gripped her seatbelt like an anchor. Her gaze flicked toward Lila, then away again. Inside, the captain spoke into his headset. "We're managing oscillation due to conflicting sensor data. Stand by for possible manual approach." Manual approach. The phrase carried weight. Fuel calculations flashed across a side display. Wind data updated. The first officer wiped his palm discreetly against his uniform. He studied the instrument cluster again. "There," he murmured. The vertical speed indicator fluttered in a pattern too regular to be random. "That's your faulty input." The captain leaned closer. "You're sure?" "No, but I'm confident." Another vibration ran through the frame, but it didn't escalate. The captain made a decision. "Isolate that feed." The first officer toggled the selector. For half a second, nothing changed. Then, the oscillation softened further. The engine pitch smoothed. The aircraft's nose steadied against the horizon. All three men watched the instruments carefully, waiting for backlash. None came. In the cabin, the change was unmistakable this time. The trembling faded into a manageable hum. Conversations resumed cautiously. A few passengers began crying quietly, release more than fear. Veronica blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by the shift. The captain exhaled through his nose. That stabilized it. "For now," he said. "You'll want to prepare for manual landing, no surprises." The first officer nodded, already adjusting calculations. The captain turned toward him fully for the first time. "You left flying?" Yes. Why? He didn't hesitate. My wife died. My daughter needed someone on the ground. The captain held his gaze for a beat. Professional respect passed between them, silent, solid. We appreciate you stepping in. He shook his head slightly. You're the ones flying it. Another calm stretch of seconds passed. Then the captain keyed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried through the cabin, steadier now. We've identified and isolated the issue. We'll be conducting a manual landing as a precaution. There's no immediate danger. In first class, relief spread visibly. Veronica covered her mouth, eyes shining, not with arrogance now, but shock. The woman across the aisle looked toward Lila and offered a small smile. Lila smiled back. Inside the cockpit, he stepped back slightly, creating space. You've got it, he said. The captain nodded once. Stay until we're on final approach. He inclined his head. Outside, the cabin crew moved efficiently, checking belts, securing carts, preparing for descent. Veronica finally looked toward the cockpit door with something resembling humility. When it opened briefly for a status exchange, she caught sight of him standing inside. Her breath caught. The man she'd tried to remove from first class now stood shoulder to shoulder with the captain, not as a passenger, as reinforcement. The door closed again, and in that quiet stretch of controlled flight, the social hierarchy that had once seemed so rigid dissolved completely. No one cared about ticket prices anymore. They cared about stability. They cared about landing. Inside the cockpit, the runway coordinates populated on screen. The captain adjusted course slightly. Wind gust data updated. The aircraft began its gradual descent. He felt it immediately, the subtle drop in pressure, the shift in engine output. Nice and easy, he murmured. The first officer followed the guidance instinctively. The ground rose slowly beneath them, and for the first time since takeoff, the cabin felt aligned with gravity again. But landing was still ahead, and manual approaches demanded precision. Every second mattered now, every input, every breath. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, focused and calm. Let's bring her home. The aircraft descended through a thin layer of cloud, sunlight flashing across the cockpit windows in sharp bursts. Below them, the runway stretched long and narrow, framed by blinking approach lights that seemed to pulse in slow motion. In the cabin, the shift in altitude pressed softly against eardrums. Conversation stopped again. The hum of the engines deepened as thrust adjusted for descent. Flaps set, the first officer confirmed. The captain's hands remained steady on the controls. Manual input only, keep it smooth. He stood just behind them now, not crowding, not intruding, simply present. Watching airspeed, watching rate of descent. Listening for any subtle irregularity in engine tone. The earlier oscillation hadn't returned, but manual landings demanded respect. Outside the cockpit, flight attendants took their jump seats. Lila tightened her grip on the armrest but didn't cry. She stared ahead with fierce concentration, as if her stillness might somehow help. Veronica sat rigid, all earlier arrogance burned away. She glanced once toward Lila, then toward the cockpit door, and for the first time, shame edged into her expression. Inside, wind gust data flickered. Crosswind picking up, the first officer said, as the aircraft nudged slightly sideways. The captain corrected gently, no overcompensation. Good, he murmured. He leaned forward slightly. Don't chase it, he said quietly. Let it settle before adjusting again. The captain nodded almost imperceptibly. Altitude dropped steadily. 1,000 feet, 500. The runway widened in the windshield. In the cabin, someone began whispering a prayer again. Another passenger squeezed their partner's hand. The tension wasn't loud anymore. It was concentrated, focused like a held breath. "Approach stable," the first officer said. A small smile flickered across the captain's face. "Let's finish this." 200 feet. The engines reduced power further. The ground rose quickly now. A subtle gust nudged the aircraft left. The captain corrected, measured, patient. Hold, the first officer murmured. 50 feet, 40, 30. The wheels met runway with a firm but controlled thud. A collective gasp exploded into applause almost instantly. Reverse thrust engaged, engines roaring briefly before decelerating. Inside the cockpit, the captain allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Welcome back," he muttered under his breath. He stepped back fully now, giving the pilots their space as the aircraft slowed along the runway. The adrenaline that had kept him razor-focused began to ease, replaced by a quiet wave of relief. In the cabin, applause grew louder, scattered at first, then unified. Lila clapped too, tears bright in her eyes. Veronica didn't clap. She stared at the cockpit door, jaw trembling. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, and the cabin energy transformed completely. Strangers exchanged looks of shared survival. Barriers dissolved. Status felt irrelevant. The seatbelt sign remained lit. He stepped out of the cockpit only when the captain signaled it was appropriate. The forward galley seemed brighter somehow. The crew member who had first approached him met his eyes with unmistakable gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "You handled it well." As he stepped back into first class, the applause intensified. Not polite, not casual, intentional. Passengers who had watched the humiliation now watched the reversal. He didn't raise his hands, didn't bow. He simply returned to his seat and knelt beside Lila. "You did great," he whispered. She threw her arms around him. "I knew you would." Across the aisle, Veronica's eyes filled. When their gazes finally met, there was no trace of earlier superiority left, only realization. The aircraft reached the gate. Engines powered down. Silence settled, heavy and profound. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we experienced a technical issue today. Thanks to the professionalism of our crew and the assistance of a highly experienced passenger, we were able to land safely. Please remain seated while we complete final checks." A ripple of understanding passed through the cabin. Veronica swallowed hard. When the seatbelt sign finally clicked off, no one rushed to stand. They looked at him instead. And for the first time since boarding, first class felt like it belonged to him. The seatbelt sign chimed off with a soft, ordinary ding. No one moved. And that was the strangest part. In first class, where people usually sprang to their feet the second wheels touched pavement, everyone remained seated, eyes drifting toward the man kneeling beside his daughter. He stood slowly, helping Lila gather her small backpack. Her hands trembled slightly, but her smile was bright, unshaken. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "You said we'd land." "I did." Across the aisle, Veronica finally rose, not with her earlier sharp precision, but carefully, like someone relearning how to stand. Passengers began murmuring to him as they stepped into the aisle. "Thank you. You saved us. God bless you." He accepted each word with a quiet nod, never lingering in the spotlight. His focus stayed anchored to Lila, adjusting her jacket, checking her breathing once more out of habit. Veronica stepped forward, blocking his path unintentionally. For a split second, old tension threatened to resurface, but her voice, when it came, was stripped of its former edge. She faltered. "I was wrong." The cabin went still again. He waited, not impatient, not triumphant, just steady. "I judged you," she continued, swallowing hard. "I thought I knew what first class looked like." He studied her for a moment. "Most people do," he said quietly. The words weren't cruel, they were honest. Her eyes shimmered. "You could have ignored it, stayed seated." "My daughter was here," he replied simply. "And the crew needed clarity. Not recognition, not applause, clarity." Veronica's shoulders lowered slightly, as though something heavy had slipped off them. "Thank you," she said again, this time without performance. The line began moving toward the exit. As he stepped forward, a passenger near the front lifted a phone hesitantly. "Would you mind if—" He shook his head gently. "No photos." The request wasn't defensive. It was protective. Of Lila. Of the boundary between past and present. As they reached the jet bridge, the captain stood waiting just beyond the cockpit door. Captain Raymond Ivers removed his hat briefly in acknowledgement. "You ever consider coming back?" the captain asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "My cockpit's a little smaller these days." Lila squeezed his hand. The captain nodded with understanding. "Well, you've still got it. Appreciate that." Behind them, Veronica paused near the doorway. For a woman accustomed to moving through life unquestioned, she now hesitated. "May I—" she began, glancing toward Lila. "I'd like to make a donation to the Hospital Foundation for Asthma Research." In her name. Lila blinked in surprise. He looked at his daughter, letting her decide. She nodded shyly. "That would be kind," he said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement." As they stepped into the terminal, applause from the cabin echoed faintly behind them, blending into airport noise. Rolling luggage wheels, boarding announcements, distant jet engines. The world resumed its rhythm. But something had shifted. People in the terminal who'd overheard fragments of conversation now glanced at him with quiet respect. The woman who had once dismissed him walked a step behind, no longer leading the air. If this moment moved you, subscribe now. Because stories like this remind us what real strength looks like. He adjusted Lila's backpack strap and guided her toward baggage claim. "You weren't scared?" she asked. "Of course I was," he admitted. Her eyes widened. "You didn't look like it." "That's the trick," he said softly. Veronica lingered a few steps back, watching father and daughter move through the crowd. Not as imposters in first class, but as exactly who they were meant to be. And for the first time, she understood that status without character was just noise. The automatic doors slid open ahead. Fresh air rushed in. He stepped through without looking back. But the ripple he left behind traveled far beyond that flight. Because sometimes the most powerful seat in first class isn't the widest one. It's the one occupied by someone who knows exactly who he is. The terminal air felt different, cooler, steadier, grounded in a way the cabin hadn't been. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Overhead announcements resumed their ordinary cadence, as if nothing extraordinary had just unfolded at 30,000 feet. He walked beside Lila without rushing, her small hand tucked firmly in his. The adrenaline that had carried him through descent had faded into a quiet exhaustion, the kind that settled deep into muscle and memory. Behind them, footsteps approached. "Mr. Rourke." He turned. Captain Ivers had followed into the terminal, hat tucked under his arm now, posture relaxed but deliberate. "I didn't want you leaving without something official," the captain said. A few nearby passengers slowed subtly, pretending not to stare. "We've already filed the maintenance report," Ivers continued, "and I made sure your assistance was noted in it." He shook his head lightly. That's not necessary. It is, the captain replied. Redundancy decisions in the air matter, and so does who helped make them. Lila looked up at her father, pride written openly across her face. The captain crouched slightly to meet her eye level. You were brave up there, she beamed. He said we'd land. Ivers smiled faintly. Good call. As the captain stood, Veronica approached again, this time without hesitation, but without the old force either. She had removed her sunglasses. Her eyes looked clearer somehow. I've already spoken to the airline's regional director, she said carefully, not to complain, to commend. He raised an eyebrow slightly. The crew, she clarified. And you. There was a sincerity in her tone that hadn't existed hours earlier. You don't owe us anything, he said evenly. I know, she replied. That's the point. Passengers from the flight passed by in small clusters. Some offered nods. Others murmured gratitude again. A man who had earlier avoided eye contact now stopped fully. I judged you too, the man admitted quietly. I'm sorry. He nodded once. We all do it. The simplicity of the response disarmed them more than any speech would have. An airline operations manager arrived moments later, breath slightly hurried. Sir, she said, extending her hand. I'm told you provided critical guidance in flight. He shook her hand politely. I offered perspective, the crew executed. She smiled. Still, we'd like to offer compensation, travel credit, anything. He glanced down at Lila, who was watching the exchange with curious intensity. We're all right, he said, and just make sure the maintenance team checks sensor latency thoroughly. That's the real priority. The manager blinked, then nodded. We will. Veronica stood quietly during the exchange, absorbing every word. Finally, when the official stepped aside, she spoke again, softly now. I built my career on perception, she admitted, on projecting certainty. Today showed me how fragile that can be. He didn't respond immediately. The crowd thinned slightly as baggage carousels began rotating nearby. Suitcases thumped onto rubber belts. I don't expect forgiveness, she continued, but I will remember this. Lila tugged his sleeve gently. Daddy, can we get something to eat? He smiled faintly. Yeah, we can. He looked back at Veronica once more, not with resentment, not with triumph. First class isn't a seat, he said. It's how you act when things go wrong. The words settled between them. She nodded slowly, as if committing them to memory. As he and Lila walked toward the escalators, the terminal noise swallowed the moment. Yet small ripples followed, passengers from the flight recounting the landing to others, describing the calm man in a first class who stepped forward when systems faltered. Reputation traveled faster than luggage. At the top of the escalator, Lila looked up at him again. You miss flying? She asked. He considered the question honestly. Sometimes, he admitted. Would you ever go back? He squeezed her hand gently. I never really left. I just changed cockpits. She grinned at that. Behind them, Veronica watched until they disappeared into the crowd. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Missed calls, news alerts already hinting at technical irregularities handled professionally. For once, she ignored them, because the story she would carry from this flight wasn't about disruption. It was about correction. And somewhere between altitude and arrival, she had been forced to confront the difference between status and substance. He stepped into a cafe line with his daughter, blending seamlessly into ordinary life again. No applause here, no announcements, just a father ordering juice and a sandwich for a girl who trusted him completely. And in that quiet, grounded space, the meaning of first class felt clearer than ever. The cafe line moved slowly, ordinary and unremarkable. The smell of coffee and toasted bread filled the air, grounding everything that had happened in something almost absurdly normal. Lila swung her backpack lightly against her leg. "Can I get the blueberry muffin?" "You can," he said, smiling faintly. "You earned it." Behind them, a television mounted above the terminal seating flickered to a local news segment. A headline scrolled across the bottom. "Flight experiences mid-air systems irregularity. Manual landing executed safely." A few passengers from their flight glanced up. One of them pointed discreetly. He kept his back to the screen. He hadn't stepped forward for recognition. He'd stepped forward because it needed doing. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "This is Rourke." A pause, then a measured voice on the other end. "Mr. Rourke, this is the airline's Chief Operations Officer. I was briefed on the landing." He closed his eyes briefly, already anticipating where this might go. "I'm glad everyone's safe," he replied evenly. "So are we. I've reviewed the preliminary report. You identified sensor latency before our own diagnostics caught the pattern." "The captain did the flying," he said again. "Yes," the COO agreed. "But your input narrowed the decision window. That matters." Lila tugged at his sleeve. He crouched slightly, balancing the phone against his shoulder so he could meet her eyes. "1 second," he whispered. The voice continued through the receiver. "We'd like to formally thank you, and there's something else." He stood slowly again. "What is it?" "We run an internal advisory board for flight systems evaluation. We bring in external expertise occasionally, if you're open to consulting." He let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh, and life had a strange sense of timing. "I'm not looking to return full-time," he said carefully. "We're not asking that," the COO replied, "but experience like yours is rare." He glanced down at Lila again. Her world was stability. Homework at the kitchen table. Inhalers by the nightstand. Being present. "I'll consider advisory work," he said finally. "Remote only." A beat of relief came through the line. That would be invaluable. They ended the call. He slid the phone back into his pocket just as their order was called. Lila carried her muffin triumphantly to a nearby table. Across the terminal, Veronica stood alone near a window overlooking the runway. She had been watching aircraft take off. Metal bodies rising into sky with mechanical certainty. She approached cautiously when she saw him sit. "I won't intrude long," she said. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. She sat. "I spent years believing success insulated me from humility," she admitted. Today proved otherwise. He stirred his coffee slowly. "Pressure reveals structure," he said, "in planes, in people." Her lips curved faintly. "That sounds like something you've lived." "I have." She nodded toward Lila. "You left flying for her?" "Yes." "Most people chase altitude," she murmured. "You chose ground." He didn't frame it as sacrifice. "I chose priority." Veronica sat with that quietly. "May I ask one more thing?" she said. He waited. "Why didn't you correct me earlier, when I was the way I was?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because arguing about status at 30,000 feet doesn't keep a plane stable." The simplicity of the answer struck harder than anger would have. Her shoulders lowered again. "I'll remember that," she said. An announcement echoed overhead for her connecting flight. She stood, hesitated, then extended her hand. He shook it. "Safe travels," he said. She paused. "You redefined first class for me." He didn't respond to that. He turned instead to Lila, wiping blueberry crumbs from her cheek. The television screen behind them updated again. Airline confirms no injuries. Credits crew and passenger expertise. He didn't look back, because victory wasn't applause. It wasn't recognition. It was walking through the terminal with his daughter, steady, grounded, unshaken, and knowing that when pressure hit, he had remained exactly who he was meant to be. The cafe slowly emptied as connecting flights were called. The rush of urgency that had filled the terminal began to thin into routine travel noise again. Rolling suitcases, boarding groups, distant jet engines spooling up for departure. He folded the napkin neatly on the tray and checked his watch. Their layover was long enough to breathe. Lila leaned back in her chair, studying him with open admiration. "When you were in there, you didn't look scared at all." He smiled faintly. "That's because I was busy." "Busy?" Thinking, listening, counting. She tilted her head. Counting what? Seconds, sounds, patterns. He tapped her forehead gently, staying ahead of what might happen next. She considered that seriously, as if filing it away for later. A few tables away, 2 passengers from their flight were retelling the landing in animated whispers. And then the captain said a passenger helped isolate the fault, one of them said. He used to fly Air Force. The story was already reshaping itself in retelling, growing cleaner, sharper. He ignored it. His phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Captain Ivers. Maintenance confirmed the faulty sensor. "You were right about the latency. We owe you." He typed back quickly. "Glad you caught it. Safe flights ahead." He put the phone away and leaned back in his chair. Across the terminal, Veronica stood near her departure gate, a suitcase upright beside her. She hadn't boarded yet. Instead, she watched the runway through the wide glass windows as another aircraft lifted cleanly into the sky. She thought about the way she'd pointed at him in the aisle, the way she'd said people like you. The words felt foreign now, like they belonged to someone else. Her assistant approached cautiously. "Ms. Halstead, boarding's begun." Veronica nodded absently. "Cancel the afternoon meeting," she said suddenly. The assistant blinked. "Cancel?" "Yes, and reschedule the charity gala planning session. I want to redirect part of the funding." "Toward what?" She hesitated, then answered without looking away from the runway. "Asthma research and aviation safety education." The assistant stared in quiet surprise. "Understood," she said. Veronica finally turned from the window. The shift in her posture wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, less rigid, less armored. Back at the cafe, Lila slid out of her chair and walked around to hug her father again. "I'm glad you're not flying all the time," she said softly. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Me too." "Do you ever miss the sky?" He thought about it honestly. The cockpit glow, the steady vibration of engines, the clarity of altitude. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't miss missing you." She smiled against his chest. A boarding announcement echoed for their next flight. He stood, gathering their things. As they walked toward their gate, a middle-aged man stepped into their path briefly. "I just wanted to say," the man said, "my son wants to be a pilot. I'm going to tell him about today." He nodded politely. "Tell him to listen carefully. That's half the job." The man smiled and stepped aside. They continued down the terminal corridor. Overhead lights reflected off polished floors, mirroring movement in soft blurs. The chaos of earlier felt distant now, like a storm already past. At their gate, passengers from the previous flight spotted him again. A few offered quiet nods. One woman mouthed thank you from across the seating area. He acknowledged each gesture with the same steady composure. No speeches, no spotlight, just presence. Lila leaned against him as they waited. "You know what first class really is?" she asked suddenly. He raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Staying calm when everyone else isn't." He smiled slowly. "That's a good definition." She grinned, proud of herself. Across the airport, Veronica boarded her connecting flight. As she stepped into that cabin, another first-class seat waiting, she paused briefly before sitting. This time, she noticed the flight attendant's tired eyes. She noticed the nervous passenger across from her. She offered a small, genuine smile. "Long day?" she asked softly. The attendant blinked. Surprised, "Yes, ma'am." "We'll get through it," Veronica said. It wasn't grand, but it was different. Back at their gate, final boarding was called. He lifted Lila's backpack and guided her toward the jet bridge once more. This time, no one questioned their place. Because some transformations aren't loud, they're quiet corrections. And somewhere between accusation and altitude, that correction had already taken flight. The jet bridge hummed softly beneath their steps as they boarded the connecting flight. No whispers followed this time, no sideways glances, just the ordinary rhythm of travelers finding their seats. He stowed their bag carefully and helped Lila buckle in. She looked up at him with that same steady trust. "This one will be easy, right?" He smiled. "Yeah, this one's just a ride." As passengers settled, a man across the aisle nodded respectfully. No applause, no spectacle, just recognition without noise. The engines outside began their low build toward departure. Familiar, controlled, predictable. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to reset. The last flight had tested more than systems. It tested patience, identity, pride, and the quiet strength it takes not to react when you're underestimated. Lila nudged him gently. "Are you thinking about earlier?" "A little." "About the lady?" He opened his eyes. "Not really." "Then what?" "About how fast people decide things." She tilted her head. "Based on jackets?" she asked. He laughed softly. "Sometimes." The plane began taxiing. He watched through the window as runway lights blinked in disciplined rows. Machines did what they were built to do. People sometimes forget. "Daddy? Yeah? Are we first class again?" He looked down at their boarding passes, then back at her. "We're exactly where we need to be." She seemed satisfied with that. As the aircraft lifted off, smooth and uneventful, he felt none of the earlier tension. No oscillation, no warning tones, just a steady ascent. Somewhere, in another aircraft, Veronica likely replayed the moment she had pointed at him. The moment she'd assumed superiority without knowledge. Maybe she'd already begun correcting that pattern. Maybe not. Transformation wasn't guaranteed, but awareness had begun, and sometimes that was enough. He glanced at Lila, already drifting toward sleep, her head resting against his arm. He thought about cockpits glowing in low light, about instruments flickering amber, about choosing ground over sky when it mattered most. First class had never been about leather seats or priority boarding. It was about how you showed up when things shook, how you spoke when others trembled, how you protected what mattered, even when someone tried to diminish you in front of a cabin full of strangers. The engines settled into cruising hum. He reached into his pocket and felt the small inhaler case clipped inside, a reminder of why he'd stepped away from one life into another. He didn't regret it. Not for a second, because the real victory hadn't been the landing. It hadn't been the applause. It had been watching his daughter breathe easily beside him, unashamed of where she sat. If this story means something to you, ask me for the next story title, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, The Mechanic They Fired. Fix the CEO's private jet midair. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?